Hi everyone, I'm starting a new 4-part video series on my top 15 principles for the opening, middle game, end game and general principles to consider in all positions. I will link these 4 videos together in a playlist on my YouTube channel, Epic Chess, so if you aren't a subscriber there, do consider joining to never miss a video, and as always, if you have any questions or comments that you want to leave down below, please do so and I'll get back to you on each one as soon as I can. So in this video we're going to focus on 15 opening principles, and we'll start with the first principle, which is fight for the center of the board. So these 4 squares in the center of the board are crucial in any game of chess, because by fighting for these squares you gain space on the board and you start to find more advanced homes for your pieces. So a good way to fight for the center of the board is by moving a pawn 2 spaces forward. By moving a pawn like this, you physically occupy the center and gain space, and you also create a threat against these 2 squares. And the other great thing about moving a pawn forward to attack the center is that you instantly open up the scope of your bishops to then move out into the game. And this brings us on to the second rule of the opening, which is develop your minor pieces into the game as soon as you can. So by the minor pieces we're referring to the knights and bishops highlighted here, and the sooner we can get these developed and into the game, the sooner we'll be fighting for key squares and putting pressure on our opponent. And this brings us on to the third rule of the opening, which is, generally speaking, you should look to develop your knights before bishops. So if we imagine that black also pushed the d pawn into the center, a good move for white here would be to play the knight out to f3. From here it's now controlling these center squares, and the reason we've sought to develop the knight before, say, the queen's bishop on c1 is that bishops are long range pieces, and so when we push the d pawn here, this queen's bishop was automatically opened up to look across the board in this direction, whereas the knight is a short range piece, and so it takes longer for it to get into the game and start controlling key central squares. And so that's why you should look to develop knights before bishops whenever you possibly can. But it should be noted, and this brings us on to the fourth rule of the opening, that you should always seek to develop your knights towards the center of the board. If we imagine that black developed his knight to h6 here, this wouldn't be a very good move, because now this knight is only exerting influence over these 2 squares, whereas the white knight is controlling 4 squares, and importantly it's controlling these 2 central squares. There's a saying in chess that a knight on the rim is dim, and this is the reason why you limit the scope of that knight once you put it out on the side of the board. So a better move for black here would be to develop that knight towards the center of the board, where it can start fighting in the same way the white knight is. And the fifth rule of the opening is that you want to bring your king to safety as soon as you can, and this is a big reason as well why we develop the minor pieces, because we need to make room for the king to castle. So if we play a few more moves through now, let's imagine that white pushes the king's pawn here to e3, black does the same in response, white develops the bishop to d3, black develops his bishop to d6, and now we're in a position to castle the king to the side of the board here, where we put the king into safety behind these 3 pawns in front of it, and there's also the added benefit of developing the rook into the game. If we imagine that in response to this move, black now castled their king to safety, this brings us on to the 6th rule of the opening, which is you should usually avoid moving the same piece twice in the opening. So a good example of this rule is, say white were to move this king's knight on f3 into the e5 square, they've now spent 2 moves moving that knight. And the problem with doing that is that we're neglecting the development of these pieces on the queen side, and so we're going against one of our earlier rules, which is develop your minor pieces as soon as you can. For our next opening principle, we're going to play the position on a few moves. Once we reach this position here, it brings us on to our 7th rule of the opening, which is activate your queen. So your queen is a very powerful piece, and so you want to have it joining the game as soon as you can, although not too early in the opening, because if you bring your queen out too early, it can be attacked by your enemy's minor pieces and forced to move away. And as we mentioned, you want to avoid moving the same piece twice in the opening wherever you possibly can. So don't bring your queen out too early is a side tip related to this one. But once you reach this appropriate point, you've developed your minor pieces, your king is safe, then you want to look to activate your queen. So here white activates the queen by moving it to this e2 square, adding some protection to the bishop and looking in this direction. And by activating the queen, this brings us on to the 8th rule of the opening, which is connect your rooks. So we can see here that the white rooks are now connected to each other because the queen's moved out of the way. and this is desirable to have because both rooks are now protected, and rooks also work very well together as a team. And this also brings us on to the 9th rule of the opening, which is always look to keep your pieces protected if you possibly can. So if you have unprotected pieces, they say in chess, unprotected pieces drop off. So here in the white position, we can see that every one of white's pieces is protected by another, except for the bishop on b2. So we could say the white bishop on b2 is a tactical liability because it's not protected by any other pieces. And this is the big thing about making sure your pieces are protected. When they're protected, it's less likely that your opponent will have tactical shots. And the flip side of that, if you can look for unprotected pieces in your opponent's position, then you could find that some tactics exist, especially if that comes in line with an unprotected king. And I did do a video on when to look for combinations in a position, so I'll link that one up on screen now in case you haven't seen it and want to check that one out. The 10th opening principle to remember is avoid swapping your bishops for knights unless you have a good positional reason to do so. So if black played, let's say, rook e8, and white now decided to swap off this dark squared bishop for the knight on f6, this would be a bad move because of the fact that this white bishop sitting on this long dark squared diagonal is a very strong piece. The white pawns in the centre are on light coloured squares, and so this bishop has a full scope raking down the board, and it's a much more powerful piece at this stage than the black knight on f6. So it wouldn't be a good idea to give up that lovely bishop. Black would now have a choice of how to recapture, either with the queen or with the pawn on g7. And here the best move would be to recapture with the queen. And this brings us on to our 11th rule of the opening, which is avoid doubling your pawns if you can do so, or once again, unless you have a good positional reason to do so. All of these rules are rules of thumb, they're not hard and fast. So if we run this back a move here, and imagine that black had captured the bishop with the g-pawn, black's now doubled up these pawns here, and the problem with that is we've now got an exposed king, and we also have an isolated pawn on h7 here. The only benefit of this pawn capture towards the centre is that this pawn is now exerting influence over this e5 square, so we've captured with a pawn towards the centre. And this brings us on to the 12th rule of the opening, which is when you're recapturing with a pawn, capture towards the centre wherever you can do so. In this position, this isn't quite applicable because there was only one possible pawn capture. But if we imagine that there had been a pawn back on e7 here, and black had a choice of capturing here with either the e-pawn or the g-pawn, then generally speaking, you're well advised to capture towards the centre. The 13th rule of the opening is avoid putting your pawns on the same colour complex as your bishop. So if we play a couple of moves through, white now plays rook fe1 here. Black responds by capturing the pawn on c4. White recaptures with the bishop. And let's imagine that black now plays a very bad move, pawn to e5. Now this move is bad for a number of reasons. We've opened up this bishop on c4 down to the king. We've weakened this f5 square, which can quickly be taken advantage of by a knight. And the third reason why this move is so positionally bad is that this bishop on d6 is now just staring at its own pawns on e5 and c5. And so it's very entombed and almost just looks like a big pawn itself. For the 14th opening principle, I've changed the position here. And this opening principle is centered around the two minor pieces of knight and bishop versus the major piece of rook and also pawn. And the principle to remember here is avoid exchanging your knight and bishop for a rook and pawn, because although this might seem like an equal trade, with these two pieces being worth 3 points each and the rook being worth 5 and the pawn 1, this actually isn't an equal exchange at this stage in the game. It could be an equal exchange or even a favourable one later into the game, especially in some endgame positions. Early on in the game, these two pieces are going to be more powerful than the one rook piece. So if we imagine that white here played the knight into g5, black then attacks the knight with pawn to h6. Many beginner players would jump in and take this pawn on f7. Black recaptures with the rook, white takes back with the bishop, king takes, and white is now just worse in this position. And the 15th and final opening principle to bear in mind is make sure you have a plan. So the way in white played, which we just saw, is a great example of a player who doesn't have a good plan. They're playing for cheap tactical shots which actually don't work very well for them. If we run back here to before white played the knight into g5, A much better move here is to play pawn to c3. And the reason this is a better move is we advance a pawn towards the centre of the board. We can see that it's now looking at this square and taking that d4 square away from this knight on c6 so that the knight can't hop in and use this square as an outpost square. I did do a video covering knights and the importance of creating advanced support points, so I'll link that on screen now as well if you want to check that one out. And the other thing about this pawn move to c3 is it supports the later advance of a pawn push to d4. And the final reason this is a good positional move is that it creates an escape route for the light squared bishop. So this bishop now has the opportunity to come back to b3 and then later into c2, especially if it was attacked by a knight on a5. And from c2, although right now it's staring at its own pawns on d3 and d4, we can imagine a scenario where the white pawn pushes to d4, and after the tension in the centre is resolved, this bishop could well come to life on this key diagonal towards the black king. So that's the 15th opening principle, is make sure you're playing chess with a plan in mind. And again, I have done a couple of videos on the importance of creating a plan in chess. So again, I'll link them on screen now if you do want to go and check those ones out. So I hope you found those 15 opening principles really helpful and they help you in your own games. If you do have any questions about this, please do leave it down below. As always, don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe, and I hope to see you again on another video.